The Inner Sydney Regional Council for Social Development is a not-for-profit peak body that operates in the Northern and Inner Sydney region. Over the last 40 years, they have been a hub for welfare agencies, community groups and local residents. This video is a celebration of the organisation's 40th year. It will look back on its formation and the role that it played in creating stronger, more inclusive and just communities in the Inner Sydney region. We will explore the organisation's history through archival footage and a series of discussions with founding members, staff and local residents that helped shape its history.
The late 60s and early 70s were a period of quite major social change for all sorts of reasons. There were two big demographic changes. The wartime generation, the adults of the wartime generation, their kids were growing up and becoming adults, and they were the first generation who really had no experience of the sort of depression and war that their parents had. So their expectations of a better life were much bigger, much wider. They were much better educated. This was the first generation where significant numbers of kids from working class backgrounds, lower middle class backgrounds had gone to universities, and all of these things had meant that there was a change in viewpoint. It was a period of the Vietnam War and very strong mobilisations against government policy in Vietnam. So it was a period of activism. The women's movement was rising, the gay movement was rising.
There was a kind of a sense of activism, and the people wanted to throw their weight into other campaigns. Resident action groups were formed, were generated by concerned residents. There were also, of course, the green bands, organised through the Daughters Labourers Federation, and particularly Jack Mundy.
The Green Bands were agreements between residents and the Builders Union not to demolish certain buildings, or in some cases, not to demolish entire suburbs.
I was making a whole lot of videos at the time.
Initiatives that were happening in Canada, where the newly emerging sort of portable video technologies meant you could use video to make community development movies.
The issues were not so much general issues, but there were more specific actions. The one I'm thinking of in particular is the campaign to stop the Fix Street Expressway. And I know people from the Inner Sydney Regional Council were involved in that. Certainly Margaret Barry was in front of the bulldozers, as were a number of other people.
And that's really what I was interested in, a sort of mix of media and community action.
Back then, video distribution was very limited. This was even before the days of VHS and certainly DVDs. So if I were to make something to reach a wider audience, I would have to make something in film, 16mm film. So that led to the first film I completed, which was called Waterloo.
In these streets as kids we played, from the park we often strayed. We knew each other like a family. Mothers, sisters, fathers, cousins, they were round us in their dozens. It was what you call a big community.
The footage I shot was very graphic. You know, those were days where people had no compunction not to, put their bodies between the bulldozers and the places that they wanted to protect.
You know the marriages that are breaking down in there, you know the sort of the problems, you know the sort of the psychiatric problems that are arising. You know 3 people have jumped in 3 weeks over in Redfern, and that's what's hit the papers, not, a lot of it else doesn't. Why?
You know they lived in those flats?
I certainly know the 2 of them lived in there, and I certainly know a woman sort of in East Lakes that jumped, and she lived there too. And they're suffering from loneliness and depression, isolation, and you just keep on doing this.
I admired Margaret because she had no real connections she had connections to the Labor Party, but she saw herself as being independent of the Labor Party, and in fact she was almost like a force unto her own.
When she bought a house on Raglan Street in Waterloo, and her and her mum shifted in, and Then Marg found out about the Housing Commission and the plans to redevelop or clear the slums out of the inner city, as the government of the day called them. In reality, they were wanting to acquire cheap land, change the nature of the planning laws and the Land Titles Acts and so on, so that they could get some money and at the same time claim that the redevelopment of the areas were beneficial. What they did was they upset the locals, something shocking, caused the union movement to come in behind. Some of the early green bands were in this area.
In 1975, I was a doctoral student in sociology at the University of New South Wales. In Surrey Hills, a group of us got together and created a thing called the Planning for People campaign. And there was myself, a number of other people, and the main activist was a woman called Enid Cook, who lived a couple of doors down from me and was very actively involved. She was a school teacher, but very actively involved in the local community. And she continued to be active in the local community until she died in her 80s, I think. So it was a very intense community in the inner city at that time. When Whitlam came to power, he and his government were very interested in how you would change the underlying institutional structure of Australia. They thought the states were very reactionary and that the Commonwealth had a role to ensure that everybody in Australia, no matter what their background, had the same rights, rather than rights that were dependent on what happened in each individual state. And they saw a huge role for local government. And in the early part of their government, 73, 74, they created the idea of a sort of regional planning framework for Australia. And this was sort of like an imagination of what Australia might look like in the future in a period when you got rid of states and you had feds and regions. So each regional council would be made up of representatives of the federal government, state government, and local communities. And they would come together to form sort of planning organisations for social development. Regional councils for social development, that's exactly what they were.
And here it was now. Printing machines, office space, all the things people in the inner city had to find themselves previously. You know, miles more than the chook raffles that they'd been used to. So I threw my hat in the ring, applied for the job as the local community worker in our South Sydney area. And because of that job, I found myself in a much better position to take on bureaucrats like Burke.
The initial move was to create a sort of an interim regional council, which was really just a couple of people thrown together with a bit of money. Over a period of 2 to 3 years, there were meetings with local government, and local government was enormously suspicious.
Very interesting times, watching politicians having to deal with a united community, and the bureaucracies couldn't handle it.
Because all these sort of radicals from the Resident Action movement would pop up and say, we want to do deals with you about this, and the federal government seemed to think it was going to put money into it, and there were a whole series of initiatives in Sydney. For instance, in Woolloomooloo, the Department of Urban and Regional Development under Tom Uren, one of Whitlam's ministers, put money in to try to stop the demolition of Woolloomooloo and turning it into a public housing area. So all these sorts of things were happening, all sorts of deals going on between local residents and the federal government, which was bypassing local government, bypassing the states, and scaring the life out of both of those institutions. And so there was a sort of impetus for everyone to get together and try and sort some of this stuff out. But the idea was that that we would be operating on a whole series of different fronts, and it was really quite an extraordinarily dynamic thing. So a number of us were involved in the Residents' Coalition stuff, which worked with the unions. Some of us were also involved with the resident action groups, which were part of the regional council process. And in Surrey Hills, where I was involved, we were involved with the City Council in setting up a local community information and action centre, which became one of the hubs for the regional council, a thing called NICNAC, Neighbourhood Information Centre, Neighbourhood Action Centre. NICNAC continued in various forms, driven very much by Enid Cook, and eventually transformed itself into the Surrey Hills Information Centre, which is now part of the Surrey Hills Library, which has an Enid Cook room to commemorate her work. So there were many different fronts, if you like, in what was essentially a process of resident and tenant democratisation.
Were originally set up by Whitlam to provide and decide on the funding for all the community services in a region, which was a brilliant idea. But of course Whitlam didn't last very long, and regional council in that form only lasted a few months. And so it was sit around the table and go, oh God, what do we do now?
The new local government minister, Paul Lander, who had been a city councillor, he was very interested in enabling local resident action and the participation by residents in local planning, etc., etc. So many of the structures that we see today, local precinct committees, rights of third-party appeal in planning cases, public participation in planning, all of that was laid down in a very short period of 2 or 3 years. And in the Sydney context, the Inner City Regional Council played a critical role in that, in resourcing it and in bringing together all the various diverse groups which existed in the city. In fact, creating the groups and then bringing them together to form coalitions.
One of the big things in the office used to be this library of all the old stuff they had and all of the old newsletters and residents' magazines and stuff, and I think they'd been quite the hub of providing that resourcing for campaigns and opposing different things. And of course Inner Voice was born out of all of that.
One of the most important elements of regional council was Inner Voice, because it was used to gather all the issues from the inner city, and it was mailed out to politicians, what they call them these days influencers, government departments, councils, not only in New South Wales, not only in Sydney, but across Australia.
Suddenly there was a way for information to broadly circulate around the place, and some of the councillors at the time were not very happy with some of the things that were being picked up and put out into the community, and there was quite a lot of backwards and forwardsing between the old ALP right councillors that used to control the area and this new body that was picking up on everything from sort of aircraft noise to local issues, what was happening in Botany Bay, and a range of different things from public transport to local services type issues. So it really did change the atmosphere around the place.
I moved into the area in 1983 with my family of a husband and 3 sons, and it was a lovely area to be in. I was working full time, and then as time went by I became involved in the community, and we started to have problems over the next couple of years, and I was working with an organisation called Public Development. In the end, we had public meetings with housing, the police, the council, because everybody was concerned about the lack of security, the lack of police involvement, lack of council, problems with maintenance. And these public meetings got very noisy, and eventually everybody decided they really had to start listening to the tenants. I was involved on the inaugural setting up of the Estates Advisory Boards. Jennifer Westacott, who is now a high-flying executive, was in housing at the time, and she was the area director, and she facilitated the setting up of the Estates Advisory Board with reps from all over Redfern and Waterloo.
I think the most important change is the establishment of the Estate Advisory Board, which is, as you know, a group of tenants who are elected by other tenants, the police, the department, council, other community providers. I think that's been really important because it's led to a couple of things. One, it's led to us getting a better understanding of what are the issues of concern to people. I was attending a lot of public meetings out there. It's very difficult to get a handle on that at the public meeting forum. But also, I guess the residents are getting a better understanding about what's possible, what's not possible through that process. We're also able to get feedback on ideas, test ideas with residents, And also we're getting cooperation and coordination between us and other government agencies and council. That's critical, because I think that often people look at large public housing estates like Waterloo and they see the department as the one and only source of failure and success, whereas that community is affected or influenced by a whole lot of agencies. And the role of the EAB is to really bring those agencies together with the residents to talk about their concerns and to come up with coordinated strategies to address them.
I started out as the HAC Development Officer, which meant that I had to work with all of the home and community care programs across the whole of Eastern Sydney in the 5 LGAs, and I had to help with disability and aged services. There was a network of services and you had to get them all working well together, because combined they provided the service.
Anyone can attend these meetings, however they are usually attended by people who provide the services and interested consumers, that is, the people who receive the services. Murray King, who suffered from polio at 17, is one of the consumers who attends these local forums.
Do the sub-regionals play a role in determining what services come to the area?
Yes, they do. It's the original, the grassroots sort of level, and what better way to start than to come up with suggestions for what needs are in the particular area, and then it gradually goes up the line through the government departments.
We've mentioned only some of the services provided by HAC, such as community transport, respite care, home maintenance and food services. Others include home care, neighbour aid, community nursing, paramedical services, other home support and community workers with the aged.
Back in the days when Inner Sydney Voice started off, Inner Sydney Regional Council and Marg and the people that worked here were very much involved in one of the first cable television programs that ran around the place. There was cable television that ran right through the key buildings in the Redfern Poets Corner buildings, and the Marg was responsible for producing a program that actually went out.
Well, what a week it's been. It's pouring down outside, and it's been pouring on our economic situation. Trade blows signals budget pain, and you can bet your darn life it's going to be budget pain this year.
When I first started in 1990, Marg was doing Inner Voice, and that took up a big and anxious chunk of time every couple of months. After a while, we all decided that Marg had a lot of other things to do as well, and so they employed Martine Brieger, who was a journalist, and she was also Marg's niece, but she was actually well established in the whole Inner Voice ethos.
For me, it was a fantastic first job out of uni, I suppose, and I was there for 7 years, but I had learnt everything you could learn to run a magazine with no money. For that region, we kept digging into get some education story. Even if we didn't have such good school contacts, we'd be looking at TAFE or migrant education or community education. I can't believe it's still going. I think it's amazing because it's never ever really had funding. I was only ever paid 2.5 days a week. But I guess what was good is being able to, when you write for a newspaper or something, there's kind of a fake objectiveness. Like there isn't a single journalist or publication in the world that's objective. Every journalist brings their own experience, their own beliefs, as professional as they try to be, need to be, and every paper is running a business. But I think it was kind of a relief to write for an organisation that it's our journal. It is subjective. It is the journal of Inner Sydney Regional Council. It expresses our values and beliefs, and that's where we write from. We don't have to be apologetic about taking a particular viewpoint or choosing certain issues. Like it's not pretending to be a newspaper. So that's one of the good things about writing for it.
Well, the other thing, of course, that Regional Council is famous for is its protests, and we were very involved and very good at them.
Mark Barry was a real fighter for the community. We had protests about the closing of the post office. We stood on the street and we protested. We still lost. The post office got closed, the bank got closed. They seemed to close everything in Waterloo.
One of the local issues that we were involved with was trying to save South Sydney Hospital. That was because the hospital had actually been set up to provide support for the large number of industries in the area, and it had a very good and very strong section to rehabilitate people who'd been injured in the workplace, and that was being closed down. The people of South Sydney was just another blow to the services for the area. And so we worked quite hard on trying to save that hospital. I'm not sure the mayors didn't know that Green Square was in the plan, and that was the reason why they were closing it down, so they could use that area to develop Green Square.
Did you get involved in any of the Canberra rallies going out?
I went to Canberra on a bus once, yes.
We've got footage of that.
Have you?
Did you want to talk about that one, that excursion?
Yeah, that was, we all went up one day and we got on the bus, all the reps. Peter Kaminga and I and Betty Bullivant and all the other people who were involved. And I think we had 2 busloads. And we all went down to Canberra to protest. That was the cuts to welfare and the cuts to housing, and the fact that the little people were just being kicked around far too much. It was a long day. We took our lunch with us, but it was there were a lot of people there.
So as we come up to celebrating the 40th anniversary of Inner Sydney Regional Council, we've had a couple of landmarks before that have reflected back on the history of the organisation. Clearly Marg Barry, who was one of the people involved through the early years of that organisation. When she left, there was a lot of coming out and telling the stories about the organisation and her role and the role of some of those founding people in that.
I've known Marg Barry for a very long time. Now, I'm giving myself away, I'm usually very discreet, but I remember Marg Barry with plaits and in school uniform. And Geraldine, I've always been prepared to listen to Marg. Because I think apart from all the things that she's achieved and all the things she's done, I think one of the important things that she's done has been to be an educator. She's been an educator of decision makers. She's actually made people who are in positions of responsibility at whatever level of government or within the bureaucracy, she's made them listen. And she hasn't just let them walk away. She said, stand there till I finish. And I've never known any way to walk away from Marg Barry. Margaret Barry, I hope you get a little bit of private space, but I think you'll always be a participating member of whatever community you're in, and we love you very much. Thank you.
After Marg died, apart from being distraught, we really wanted to find a good way to remember her and her work. And along with her niece Martine, who'd been with us doing Inner Voice, she and I decided that a good way to do it would be to continue Marg's idea that the inner city is a good place for people to live, that there is very strong community connections, and that while they might not have a lot of money or they might have problems, they also support each other, and so it's not all dreadful. And so I set up the Marg Barry Memorial Lectures once a year, found someone who had something important to say about community development and about the strength of people supporting each other, even if they didn't have other resources. I like to think that the memorial lectures supported on an ongoing way the work that Marg was doing.
As of November 2015, the Inner Sydney Regional Council for Social Development will be rebranding. The organisation as a whole will share the name of its magazine, Inner Sydney Voice.
And what I think was long-term was the sense that local communities realised that they had a right to participate in the decisions that affected them.
It's very interesting now to watch the West Connect, the plans being revealed by the state government. The response to that, it very much echoes the response in the 70s to similar plans. And there's always a group of people who feel that, for very good reasons, that plans that don't include people need to be challenged.
So you can see some of the changes and plot how much things have and haven't changed over the period since Inner Voice, as it started off to be called, and now Inner Sydney Voice, as it tells the stories. And in some things you'll see quite significant changes, and in other things that you won't see very much change at all. We're still fighting some of the same battles that were being fought back then.
We're seeing the same government thought process applying. It's come forward, it's into a new cycle, where once again the government of the day is talking about redeveloping the housing estates and redeveloping the inner city areas.
In disability and aged care, we're going down the social insurance path. Certainly in terms of disability, that is the new model. It's with the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So currently the government funds services to provide support for people with disability. They use paid workers and volunteers. Obviously volunteers only where it's appropriate, but in this new model, the funding goes directly to the client. I'm very hopeful that it's going to work really well for people with disability, and it's going to provide them with more flexibility and greater depth of service, because everyone needs to have a highly individualized plan. That is really positive from the consumer perspective, but in terms of the service providers and being able to generate enough income to keep the doors open, there are a lot of challenges.
Before I left Regional Council, I picked up the idea that it's not just about the organisations, it's about trying to have strong, healthy communities. I was always struck by the fact that whenever there's a bushfire or a flood, the government always runs in and says how wonderful and strong the community is. And they rely on the strength of people helping each other at that very local level. But in between, there's not a lot done to make sure that communities are strong.
We work in a very different sphere than perhaps the Marg Barry days, but we still owe a lot to what took place in that time, and we need to be respectful of the work that took place then. And so when we continue to work into the future, we need to carry what happened then with us, but we also need to make adaptations for the world that we live in now, which is a global world, a media, social media world, a very different world, and communities face very different issues. Social housing communities in the inner city are probably more marginalised than ever before because they are now juxtaposed by very wealthy neighbours. That wasn't the case before. So the work that we do now is about trying to make sure that in that context of being in a gentrified area, that the marginalised communities have the resilience to maintain their sense of community, their pride, and feeling part of the wider community.